They say, a man's life begins the day he is named. But what if your name is never spoken, only spat? What if it is scrubbed from every stone, every tablet, every whisper of wind through the reeds of the Nile? He was born under a sun that gave no warmth. His mother bled in the dust outside the house of the overseer, and her scream was muffled by the crack of a whip and the hiss of sand blown through papyrus fields. His hands learned the rhythm of brick mixing and water hauling before they knew what bread felt like. The bricks, they were the color of dried blood, and they devoured his fingertips. A mischant during labor, the whip would kiss the spine, glance at the overseer's wife. The stars did not twinkle, they watched, cold and indifferent, like the eyes of priests who measured bodies as tools, not souls. Dreams offered no escape, but that was for the rich, the pharaohs, the scribes. For them, death came with prayers, with jars to hold their lungs, with gold masks and feather-weighing rituals. He learned to stare blankly, to chew silence like bitter herbs, to pray not for freedom, but for invisibility. For Nebtu, death was an accident waiting to happen. When it came, it would be fast, dirty, and forgotten. In his sleep, he still heard the groan of pulleys, the screams of crushed fingers, the dull thud of a man falling from scaffolding and being buried not in earth but in silence. One day Tefanu laughed too loudly at a guard's limp. Just one laugh. That night, his body was dragged behind the oxen carts, stripped naked, skull crushed like an overripe fig. The next morning the guard said nothing. The sun rose. Work resumed. The whip sang again. No mourning, rites, just dust on dust. The whip would curl around the throat like a jealous serpent. It taught Nebtu obedience, but it never taught him peace. By age 7, the creases of his palms were no longer lines of fate but cracks, like a dried riverbed bleeding with lime and ash. They called him Nebtu, the dust that clings to feet not out of affection but mockery, a name not meant to be remembered, only used. The boy grew in silence. He learned to bow before he could speak. But there was no village. There was a pit, a prison without walls, only ditches, sand, and lines of backs bent toward the rising tombs. The temples above spoke of eternity, carved with stories of gods, heroes, and golden afterlives. But no one carved the story of the hands that built them. No one chiseled Nebtu's life into stone. And yet, that was the easy part. The real torment was the song of the whip. It did not strike randomly. It had a voice, a language of pain spoken through flesh. He lived within the bones of the city, the places tourists today would call the worker villages. At night, he slept under a sky so wide it threatened to swallow him. Nebtu's father had once told him quietly that death in Egypt was not the end, it was only the door to a better life. There was a boy once his friend, if slaves are allowed such things, named Tefanu. In Nebtu's world, tears were currency you could no longer afford, but that would not last. Because one day, the royal architect came, and he pointed at Nebtu and said, "That one, strong back, quiet eyes. I want him for the tomb." But it was meant to be an honor. It would become a curse. The royal architect's word was law. There were no questions, no hesitation. Nebtu was pulled from the worker-s pit and led north, his feet still bleeding from the lime pits, his back still sore from the day's lashings. But none of that mattered. The tomb waited, and the tomb was hungry. "You will build the Pharaoh's door to the afterlife," they said. But behind their smiles lurked something darker, because those who entered the tomb did not always leave. He arrived at the Valley of Kings beneath a crimson dusk, where the air tasted of iron and incense. The cliffs loomed like the broken teeth of forgotten gods. Here, under the gaze of Anubis and the long shadow of Osiris, men dug not just into the earth, but into the sacred heart of eternity. When he was ordered to haul a sarcophagus lid carved with screaming faces, he obeyed. When he was told to wall up a passageway with fresh food offerings, still steaming inside, he obeyed. Quietly, hesitantly, to a fellow slave named Menka, who still wore a copper ring from a mother long dead. Even when he realized there was no exit plan, no stairway leading out once the tomb was sealed, he obeyed. The tunnels twisted like a serpent swallowing itself, each corridor darker than the last, lit only by oil lamps that hissed like dying things. Nebtu learned quickly. One breath too deep, and your lungs burned. One stone mislaid, and you vanished beneath a collapse. Screams didn't echo. They simply dissolved. When they pulled him up, he was barely conscious. The architect stood above him, his face expressionless. This was not a building site. It was a mausoleum for the divine. Every stone laid was paid for in blood. Some wore amulets carved with desperate symbols, zoonoficial charms, unblessed by any priest, meant to ward off something unnamed. A vertical drop, narrow as a coffin, meant for the Pharaoh's golden throne. As Nebtu descended into its throat with rope and torch, he felt the air tighten. There were markings on the walls, ancient ones, older than even the Pharaoh. Eyes, always eyes. Watching from the stone, waiting. One night an old man murmured to Nebtu, "The dead don't sleep here. They listen. They wait." Cloaked in linen dyed the color of rot, they moved silently through the tunnels, watching, measuring, judging. If a slave asked too many questions, if he noticed a door that wasn't supposed to be there, he disappeared. The rock would be resealed, the name struck from the list. Nebtu was told he was lucky, chosen. The air inside was suffocating, thick with dust and crushed bone. The workers here were different, colder, silent, with eyes that twitched at sounds only they could hear. But it was not ghosts that Nebtu feared most. It was the priest, engineers. It were the Pharaoh's chosen keepers of blueprints, of death traps, of secrets never meant to reach the sun again. Nebtu learned to never look too closely, because disobedience was a slower death. There was one moment, just one, when he allowed himself to speak. "Will we ever leave this place?" Minka's answer was not a word. It was a look, hollow, defeated, like a man who had already buried himself. That night, the architect ordered the southern shaft completed. Halfway down, the rope slipped. He dangled for hours, blood rushing to his skull, the torch sputtering in his hand. "You have seen too much," he said. Nebtu braced for the blade, but none came. Instead, the priest engineers took him deeper, beyond the mapped tunnels, into a place where no hieroglyphs were written, where the dead things were not buried in peace, but bound in chains. "You will serve now," one of them hissed, not the Pharaoh, but the tomb itself. And Nebtu, who had once prayed for invisibility, finally got his wish. They sealed him in. But the story does not end there. It was only the beginning. There is a silence so complete it hums. It's a silence that deafens not the ear, but the mind. That was the sound Nebtu awoke to, if waking is even the word. A crawl space behind the main chamber, carved hastily into limestone, masked by false bricks. There was no lamp, no voice, only him and the tomb. For time in the tomb was not marked by sun or stars. Thirst burned, then dulled. Eventually, even pain became something distant, like a memory from another life. But thoughts remained. At first he recited the names of those he remembered. His mother, Tefanu Menka, who had touched the innermost sanctum, who had witnessed the final rites, the last secrets, the corridors that twisted behind the false walls, and led into chambers the gods themselves feared to tread. But names fade when no one else says them. Soon, even his own name dissolved. But by the drip of condensation down ancient walls, by the groan of unseen stones settling into place like a beast curling around its meal, sometimes voices that echoed behind the stone. They were not dreams, no. Dreams are gentle, brief. These were memories that were not his. A pharaoh screaming as his soul was judged. A child buried alive with a royal hound. A slave hammered into a wall for glancing too long at sacred ink. The space was small. Days bled together like spilled ink. Nord then vanished. He no longer knew if he was Nebtu or something else. Alive, waiting, beating. The priest engineers had not lied. He was not buried. He was kept fed just enough. A slip of water every 3 days poured through a hole in the ceiling. Something else. Something older than Osiris. Guardian of knowledge so forbidden it could not be written. That was why the tomb had to be sealed not just with stone but with madness, with silence, with him. Dried grains scattered like offerings to a beast. They did not want him to die. They wanted him to wait, because the tomb required a guardian. He saw visions of cities crumbling into sand, of gods weeping black tears, of empires built on bones so ancient they had forgotten their own names. Not one of gold or stone, but of flesh. Someone who had seen. Dust fell from the ceiling. A voice real human and terrified code through the tunnel. He became their seal, their warning, a living curse, not fear, not faith, but a whisper in the dark, and the tomb changed him. He began to see things in the dark, flickers, shapes. He wept, then he laughed. Then he forgot why either mattered. Once he tried to end it sharpening a stone, aiming it toward his throat. But when he pressed the edge against his skin, something stopped him. If you die, who will carry the sin? That night, he felt something move in the wall beside him. Breath, wet, rotten, not quite human. He pressed his ear to the stone and heard no, felt a slow, rhythmic thudding, like a heart buried deep within the pyramid itself. He was not alone. He never had been. The Pharaoh had been buried with his guards, his treasures, his wives. The whispers became songs. The walls began to glow, with light but with memory. And through it all, Nebtu remained, not dead, not alive, vessel, a warning. The day came, he does not know when. The air shifted. Someone there, foreign tongue, accent like broken water. A torch flickered in the corner of his vision. Nebtu did not speak. He reached for the stone. Behind him, the tomb beat faster. The intruder had broken the seal, and Nebtu was ready. The intruder's torch quivered like a soul, unsure if it belongs in this world. Footsteps crunched over sacred dust, the kind that had not been touched for 3,000 years. Every sound echoed with a hesitation that did not belong to the living, but to the dead reconsidering their slumber. He was young, a scholar, European perhaps.
Ow.
Sweat gleamed on his brow, though the air was cold as a tomb's breath. In his hand, a journal, thick with maps and glyphs he thought he understood. His skin had grown pale as limestone, stretched thin over muscles hardened by silence. Hair long, matted with the tomb's dust. His eyes owled, the eyes held the memory of centuries, and they did not blink. Behind him, a camera, a light. Civilization reaching into the dark with trembling fingers. He did not know he was not the first, but he would be the last. To protect. Nebtu crouched in the shadows, his body no longer quite a man's. He watched the young man approach the chamber of the false sarcophagus, the one built to distract, to deceive. The symbols here, they don't match the royal canon. They're older, possibly pre-dynastic. My God, the scholar knelt. Brushed aside sand, spoke into his recorder. I believe this is the hidden chamber mentioned in the lost scrolls of the 4th dynasty. He reached forward, fingers grazing the ancient seal. The air shifted. He simply looked into the young man's eyes, and the scholar froze. Not from fear, but recognition. For in that gaze, he saw not a monster, but truth. Truth too large, too old, too sacred for language. Somewhere behind the wall, a groan not mechanical, but organic reverberated through the stones. The tomb was awake, and Nebtu stepped forward. He did not speak. He did not warn. Then the whisper came. Not from Nebtu. Symbols glowed, not painted, but burned into time. He did not kill. He did not need to. The tomb did that. Images of sacrifice, of betrayal, of gods who devoured their own worshippers rather than grant them peace. Sand swallowed. The chamber sealed again, as if nothing had stirred. Another lost soul in the Valley of Kings. The 23rd in 15 years. They would blame dehydration, heat stroke, collapse. A temple built not for prayer, but for imprisonment, not from the man, from the walls. He is the key, and you are the door. The chamber lit, not with fire, but with memory. No, the Pharaoh was not buried to ascend. He was buried to be kept from rising. The tomb was not protection, it was containment. And Nebtu, forgotten Nebtu, was not a victim, he was the lock. The scholar screamed, tried to run, but the floor split. Camera fell, light scattered. Nebtu moved not like a man, but like something pulled by a greater will. Stone reshaped, but something had. For the next day, headlines would whisper of a missing researcher, but below, far below, the tomb beat once more. Nebtu sat in the dark, still as a statue carved by time itself. He did not age. He did not hunger. He waited, because another will come.
Ow.
And the door must always breathe. So next time you marvel at the wonders of Egypt, the towering pyramids, the golden masks, the delicate hieroglyphs, remember, they were not built to glorify the dead. They were built to imprison something far worse than death. And somewhere, in the dark beneath your feet, a man without a name still watches, still listens, still waits for you.